Makes it difficult.
Well, Richard, you're joining us tonight. Well, welcome. Let's see, we're in chapter 2 of Mark. We did not make it through chapter 2. Just so you know, I have 9 pages of notes for tonight. You know what that means? We're not making it through chapter 3 either. I'm just already counting on it. I'm okay with that. I think maybe I loaded the first one of these the videos on YouTube today. I think I'm gonna go back and rename it and put week 1 and not chapter 1, so that we know it's not necessarily the whole chapter. But why don't we start out with prayer? Father, we love you. We thank you for today. We thank you for your love and your grace in our lives, and we thank you for your word that you give to us. We think we can come together and study your word and learn from it. Let it shape us and let it inform us on who it is you want us to be in your world. Help us to see it the way we ought to. Let your spirit guide and direct us tonight, Father. We love you. Amen. All right, well, there are a few things that I want us to talk. I think we ended in chapter 2, verse 18. But I want to back up, if I can, just for 1 second, into verse 17. Chapter 2, verse 17 says, when Jesus heard this is when the Pharisees and everybody were making fun of him or being mad at him because he was eating with scum, as my version says. He was eating with the tax collectors and sinners, who were the worst of the worst for them. So when Jesus heard this, he told them, healthy people don't need a doctor, sick people do. I have come not to call those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners. There's an interesting interaction right there that I think we just need to maybe highlight just for a second. That, Jesus looked at them and said, look, if I'm the physician, if I'm the doctor, I need to be where the sick people are. I don't need to be isolated away. But it was also a bit of an indictment to the Pharisees. You call yourself righteous. He said, you think you are righteous. I love that. And those who think they are righteous, because they, in their own mind, their legalisms, their keeping of the rituals and the rules made them righteous. But he's like, you think you're righteous, but you're not really affecting anybody. And he's really calling them an indictment on them to say, you need to be with the sick people. And I also like that he said he's with those who know they are sinners. That's also an indictment to us to say we don't need to judge people. They already know if they're Christian or non-Christian, right? But yet that's what the Pharisees were doing, where it was constantly judging, constantly reminding people how righteous they were and how unrighteous the other people were, right? And so there's a huge indictment that Jesus makes to the Pharisees. And I like that when Jesus is here, earlier it says that he was with many people who were following him who were sinners. The people who followed Jesus were not the people who were following the Pharisees. They were staying away from the Pharisees. Mm-hmm. And the people that were disenfranchised from the church, that were disregarded by the church, that were looked down upon by the church, were the ones Jesus was seeking after. And I think that's an indictment to us, or a challenge to us to say, who should we be going after? Who should we be hanging out with? Who should we befriend and help? Who needs Jesus more? Those that are here in church all the time, or those who aren't in church at all? Those who know Jesus, or those who have no idea of Jesus? And so there's a lot to that for us. So with that being said, let's jump into chapter 2, starting with verse 18. How's that? Get my notes. There we are. All right. Would somebody like to read that section 18 through 22?
The disciples of John and the Pharisees were fasting. Then they came to him and said to him, why do the disciples of John and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, can the friends of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. But the days will come when the bridegrooms will be taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, or a new piece pulls away from the old, and the tear is made worse. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, or else the new wine bursts the wineskins. The wine is spilled, and the wineskins are ruined. But new wine must be put into new wineskins.
All right, so there's a couple things here that we hear Jesus talking about. One, there's an issue of fasting comes up. What do you know about fasting? When you hear the word fasting, what do you think of?
Give up food.
Okay, give up food. All right. How often? When should you do it? How often do you do it? Why do you do it? Why did they do it? How often did they do it? Do you have any idea?
I think they did it about twice a week, 3 times a week.
Mosaic law says that they should fast once a week. That's on the Sabbath. Pharisaic law was twice a week because they wanted to be a little bit above, a little bit more. And for them, when they fasted, it had multiple purposes. One was a spiritual deepening. Okay, that was the purpose of fasting, was so that you could have a closer relationship with God, your reliance now on God and not on food. But for the Pharisees, it was also a way to show others that they were holier than thou. And so you have a little bit of that going on. And now you have a comparison game going on here where my version says, why don't your disciples fast like John's disciples and the Pharisees do? Because here it was the Sabbath, and his disciples weren't fasting apparently. Or it was the day in which the Pharisees fast, and it wasn't time for them to fast. And Jesus' response is very interesting. He talks about the bridegroom. What do you hear when you hear bridegroom? That's a different imagery. That's a different idea. What do you think they heard? What do you hear? Jesus.
Yeah, it's our bridegroom.
Okay, what do you mean by that? Where does that all come from?
Wedding.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a wedding implication there. Marriage. So there's a relational thing. Commitment. Covenant. Even more than, commitment. We see it in the United States. The marital commitment, it can be broken. A marital covenant should never be broken. There's a difference between the two. Covenant is till death do us part. Some people say that when they're getting married. I don't know if they all believe that or intend that all the time. If you go back in the Old Testament, God is often described as the bridegroom of Israel. Go back to Hosea and Isaiah. God is describes himself, and he is described by the prophets as being the bridegroom. In other words, he is the lover of, protector of, provider for Israel. And now Jesus is now equating himself with God in that same way. So when the Pharisees heard bridegroom, they immediately now going, Jesus is equating himself. It's a bigger step than what we hear. It's more than just a relational love or a relational friendship or a liking. Jesus is saying the relationship that God had with Israel is now the relationship that I have with these people, with my disciples, and with the world. There's another interesting thing. When you go to a wedding feast, it's very joyful, right? How many people wear black to a wedding other than the groom, right? I'm usually not even a groom. I didn't even, as a groom, I wore gray. You don't show up at a wedding in all black, do you? You show up at a funeral in all black, right? But a wedding is supposed to be a joyful thing. And so he's also now implicating in this and saying our relationship with God is to be a joyful thing, not a oppressive hardship kind of thing. It's supposed to be something that you look forward to. And in the Jewish community, the wedding feast was a multi-day event. It was not just a one and done kind of thing. Remember the first recorded miracle that Jesus did? Turned water into wine, right? And there was a huge party. It was a huge party, multi-day party. And by the time Jesus had turned this water into wine, that had probably been 2 days or 3 days worth of a feast going on.
You drunk all the other stuff.
Now, do you find it interesting? I love how Mark orders these things. Where was Jesus when we just went back into chapter 2 prior to verse 18? What was he doing?
He was with the tax collector.
What were they doing?
Eating.
Feasting, right? And what's the complaint? Why aren't you people fasting? And what does Jesus pull out? Because we're feasting. And so you have that. That's remember I said earlier, you'll get some sandwich things from Mark. There's your sandwich. He just sandwiched fasting between feasting. And so here you have where they're trying to make things down. Why aren't you doing this? And Jesus is like, because we're partying. This is what we're supposed to do right now. But then Jesus did something else. He made a veiled reference. Did you pick it up? What was this veiled reference? Verse 20. No.
That he'll be taken away.
He'll be taken away. This is the first reference in Mark to Jesus' crucifixion.
Yes, it is.
This is the first time in Mark where Jesus says, we're here, we're having a good time, but there will be a time when this won't be happening. There's going to be a time where they're going to be wearing black. There's going to be a time where there's going to be fasting. There's going to be mourning. Where there's going to be not so happy times. And so here's a veiled reference in one verse that says, I'm here, and we're going to have a good time while I'm here, but I'm not always going to be here. He didn't necessarily say, I'm going to the cross. He's not ready to unveil that for them yet. But he is saying, I'm not going to be here forever. And so then he moves into the wine and wineskins. All right? What's that?
Fermentation, which causes the old skins to break.
So what's the allegory? What's the parallel there? What's he talking about? I mean, when you hear that, you hear, okay, yeah. I mean, if you take it literally, an old wineskin, if it has a hole in it, you can't patch it with a new wineskin because it's going to shrink and it's going to break the hole open. Or if you have clothes and you get a hole in the clothing, it's a worn clothing, it's already been shrunk, and if you put new cloth to it, that new cloth is going to shrink when you wash it and it's going to make a bigger hole again. What does that have to do with Jesus? What's the parallel? What does that have to do with anything about Jesus? Any idea?
I think he's talking about the transformation that you go through, that you're a new creation.
Okay.
Law to grace.
Ooh, that's exactly it.
What is it?
The old framework of the religious law, of the old religious system, cannot be tied to the new. So don't impose your Judaism upon Christianity. Because the two don't meld together completely. There is a big difference between them. And so he's saying, look, there's new life in this kingdom, and you can't attach it with the old ritual and the Pharisaical laws, because they won't fit. And they're trying to force an old framework into a new movement, into Jesus's movement that will only lead to rupture and spilling and holes and not a lot of good. From a Wesleyan perspective, we believe salvation is not just forgiveness, it's transformation. And so just like the new wine expands, the holy life with God births in us, it requires a new way of thinking, a new way of living, and a new way of worshiping. And that's what Jesus is saying here. Look, this new kingdom that's coming, that's here now with me, it's going to require a new way of worship, a new way of thinking, a new way of living. It's going to be a total transformation. And so you can't impose the old into the new because it just doesn't fit. It's like putting a round peg in a square hole, or vice versa. They just don't meld together. I also like how he's using the whole thing between these two, that there's joy in the new kingdom. There's lots of joy. You got the wedding, you have a feast, there's wine, there's a party, there's a lot of joy in their life. There's nothing oppressive in the new kingdom. Whereas the kingdom that the Pharisees were propagating, there was not a lot of joy. There was a lot of oppression. There was a lot of, I say more stick than carrot, right? Yeah, there's a lot of rule keeping. And there's a lot of, you got to do it this way or you're not in. And by the way, you could never do it all that way.
And by the way, we're hypocrites.
Exactly. And so what does that say for us? How does that apply to us today? How does this section?
Accepting him makes things anew, breaks down, like the last year's wine bags, it breaks it down, destroys it. So he's doing away with the old and bringing in the new.
Yeah. See, out with the old and in with the new. Same with our lives. When we have a transformation with Christ, it's now an out with the old and in with the new.
We're a new creation.
We're a total new creation. It's like an out with the death and in with the life. Because the life that we were leading before Christ was leading to death, whereas the life that we lead with Christ leads to life. So there's a lot of joy in that. And maybe it should help us to maybe evaluate our own routines. You know, are we stuck in a routine, a pattern that's, we're doing what we do spiritually because it's just a ritual? Or is it a lifestyle because that's who we are? Because I think I don't want to bash the Pharisees completely. Because I think they started out with a pure heart, with right motives. And I think for them it became something that became a ritual. It became dry and stale. And I think we sometimes can fall in that same line. I don't know if you've noticed, but we've had a lot of communion in the last 6 months.
Yes, we have.
Yeah. I hope it hasn't become a ritual. Because each week, I want to tie it to a new challenge or a new way for us to think of and allow it to become something different for us and not just because we're doing it because. And I honestly believe we could do communion every week if we do it the right way and it not be a ritual. It becomes heartfelt. Okay? That's just a possibility. Okay? What else? Anything else that you hear in that section?
If you take that whole section from 18 to 28, as you were talking, Mike, about it being a sandwiched section,
Yeah.
it is about relationship, but from Ezekiel, it states what the Sabbath actually is, which is a sign of the people or that religion, and it sets us apart from any other religion on the planet because we use that day to worship God.
Yes.
So anytime Mark, who's talking to Gentiles or people who don't understand Jewish law, he's going to take a lot to explain that.
Yes.
And this whole section, even though it seems disjointed, like you pointed out, like snapshots, it actually is sandwiched because it starts out with what is fasting and why is that important, and it ends with Sabbath and why that's important, and in between it talks about all those things that you were saying. This actually has a whole lot more in it than first pass reading through.
Yeah. Oh,
But
yeah.
I love the end of it because we're made for the Sabbath, which doesn't mean we have complete freedom to do whatever we want on the Sabbath. There are very specific things we're supposed to be doing on God or the Lord's Day. But it's interesting to me that He made the Sabbath for us, so that we set that time aside for that relationship, for that bridegroom, for that new wine covenant, for all of those things. That's what that was set aside for.
Right. You jumped a little bit ahead of us.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. We haven't got to the Sabbath yet. That was the next thing. But for that section, yes. And so that's the thing. Everything that you're reading here in chapter 2 really all fit together. They sound disjointed. You go from guys coming in and tearing up a roof and putting guys down on a mat, putting the guy down on a mat, being healed. You've got calling of Matthew. You've got the eating with sinners. You've got fasting. You've got wine. You've got bridegroom. You got all this, but they're all really, they fit together more than what they're disjointed. They sound like they're very different, but they all are heading for the same purpose. And there's a lot of explaining Judaism to Gentiles in the midst of this. Exactly. Exactly.
Mike, I see something else that, I hadn't seen before. I mean, I think it was in my mind, but I wasn't, never prepared to say it this way. But the old wineskins have served a purpose.
Mm.
So the old way.
Yeah.
Served its purpose.
Exactly. Yeah, he's not saying the old wineskins were bad. He's not saying they were worthless.
Right.
He's just saying their time has come.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of that same thing. Well, let's look at the next section, 23 through 28. Discussion about the Sabbath. Anybody want to read?
And it happened that he was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. The Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need, and he and his companions became hungry? How he entered the house of God at the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests, and he also gave it to those who were with him." Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath."
So here he calls himself the Lord of the Sabbath. What is the Sabbath? When you hear the word Sabbath, what do you think of?
Day of rest.
Okay, what does that mean? Because we don't. Do we? I work every Sunday. It's the only day I work, so it's okay. And really only about 30, 40 minutes of that, so that's not bad. So.
Liar.
I'm sitting, I'm not lying. What do you hear when you hear the word Sabbath? What does it mean to have a day of rest?
Contemplating with the Lord.
And what does rest look like to you?
The absence of work.
Okay. When can Sabbath become unsacred?
Whenever you're not devoting it to the Lord.
Okay.
I'm guilty of not doing that always. I mean, I forget, as I'm older, I'm concentrating more on it being the Sabbath.
Yeah.
I've had kids and grandkids and work and get ready for work the next day, and I think, what am I doing,
But can you not worship while doing that?
Yeah.
I remember when I first started going to church, it was because of a relationship that I had with a girl. That was my whole emphasis. It was good attractment, I'm just saying. But I would spend a lot of time on Sunday at her house with her parents, her brothers and her sister. And on that day, they were not allowed to watch TV. There was total silence pretty much in the house. You weren't allowed to go out and play. You weren't allowed to do anything other than you take a nap. And you go back to church. That was it. You could play the piano and sing. And I'm like, okay, this is just weird. They would talk about, you're not allowed to, you can't go play basketball, you can't go golf, you can't go mow the lawn, you can't go because that's work, and that's physical exertion. That's not what the Sabbath is. The Sabbath is a time of do nothing, of total rest. I'm like, there are times I'm out on my boat and I'm fishing. It's pretty peaceful, pretty restful. There are times I'm out on a golf course and I'm hitting a ball. It's frustration. No, I mean, it can be very peaceful. I think we can put it in a box and say there's a lot of do's and don'ts.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about here. Because that's what the Pharisees made it into, right? You can only walk so far. You could only do so much. You couldn't eat grain. You couldn't go harvest. If somebody, I mean, Jesus got crucified almost literally for healing somebody on the Sabbath. We're going to read about that later. I mean, all these things that they wanted to put the Sabbath into a box and say, this is what you can and cannot do. And Jesus made a statement.
Made the 10 Commandments into 413 regulations.
Exactly. And Jesus said the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of the people, and not the people to meet the needs of the Sabbath. And when we make the Sabbath into a legalism of you can and cannot do this and that, if somebody does that, then they're not keeping the Sabbath. If they're doing this, then they are keeping the Sabbath. And if they're doing what I'm doing, then they're keeping the Sabbath. If they're not doing what I'm doing, they're not. That's really what it came down to, right? Then we make it into it's not a Sabbath. It's not a time of worshiping God. It's a time of almost being oppressed by. And it makes it tough. There was a command, the Sabbath was a command of God to rest on the seventh day. It's modeled out right after God's resting at the end of creation. I mean, even God needed to rest. So there's a need, there's a necessity for us to have rest, right? It was intended as a gift to us, a day of delight and restoration, as we find in Isaiah. But Jesus, and by Jesus' time, 39 categories of work were defined by the Pharisees, including reaping, which is what the disciples were accused of, picking grain. I lived on a farm. We had wheat fields all over the place. It really doesn't take a whole lot of work to get a little bit of grain off the head of wheat. I mean, you put it in your hand, you rub it together, that's it. The chaff goes away and you've got little seeds of wheat, which tastes really good. It becomes like gum. It's kind of fun.
I feel like rest looks different by each individual person.
I think so.
Some people, I mean, you might be relaxed on the golf course, probably not me.
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
I enjoy painting, I zone out. It's not work for me.
Yeah. Can I have a confession for you? There are times, I don't tell your husband this, but there are times I hope nobody has signed up to mow on a week. Because there are times that I just need to go out on a lawnmower and put in my headphones and just zone out and mow. And it's peaceful, rest.
Whenever I'm mowing,
But some people would say I'm working.
whenever I'm mowing on a farm, what I'll do is I'll be so introverted that I'll just break out in song.
Yeah.
And I can't carry a son in the bucket like you, but when I'm on that tractor, well, I can
He means
sing
that in
the
love.
storm.
It's okay. Yeah. I mean, I'm glad that the tractor's louder than me when I'm doing it. But yeah. So Jesus is not violating the law of Moses when he's eating and when his disciples are picking the grain. He's violating the Pharisaic man-made law that were additions to the law. And so we have to be very careful and very mindful. Are we breaking God's law or man's law when we say that's not worship or that is worship, that is rest and that's not rest? And so we have to be very careful in that. And I think that's an issue, just like what you were saying, Peggy. It's different for every person. It's an issue of our heart. You know, we have to be very honest with ourselves, very truthful with ourselves. Is what I'm doing restful, or is this work? Am I able to worship doing this, or is this not? For me, a lot of times when I'm golfing, I'm in the midst of a relationship with somebody. I get 4 hours alone with somebody, or 3 somebodies sometimes, and it's a great time of just conversation, great time of relationship. You know, that's not a bad thing, not at all. And so, the word for unlawful that Jesus uses here, he uses a Greek word it's referring to God's law, not the Pharisees' law, not man's law, not the establishment's law. So it's not like a criminal law. We're going to go back to God's law, the 10 Commandments. Sabbath is rooted in the Hebrew Shabbat, which means to cease or to rest. It's rich in theological meaning rest and holiness and worship and trust in God's provision. And then he calls himself the Son of Man. That's the title, Jesus' favorite title for himself. Emphasizes his messianic authority, and it's rooted in Daniel chapter 7 and its solidarity with humanity. So there's some huge things that Jesus talks about in the midst of this. But again, you have Mark using this as a way to explain to Gentiles what Judaism looks like, because they're very unfamiliar. So he's got to begin to use that as a talking point for them. And for us, from a Wesleyan perspective, true holiness that we find in Sabbath reflects the character of God. It helps us especially to emphasize love and mercy, justice. And Jesus' action shows that compassion is greater than rule following. It's more compassionate to eat and not go hungry than it is to follow the rule of you can't pick wheat on Sunday or on the Sabbath. For them it was Saturday, by the way. And so there's some great significance that we find in the midst of all that Jesus is talking about here. So look at that. We made it through chapter 2. Do you think we could make it to how far in chapter 3? Let's. Oh, I bounced past. No, I did pass. There we go. There we go. Chapter 3, verse 1 through 6. Jesus went into the synagogue again and noticed a man with a deformed hand. Since it was the Sabbath, Jesus' enemies watched him closely, as enemies can only do, right? If he healed the man's hand, they planned to accuse him of working on the Sabbath. Like how this flows right out of the last section, just talking about what the Sabbath is, talking about work, not work, talking about what you can and can't do, what's the legalism here. Jesus said to the man with the deformed hand, "Come and stand in front of everyone." Then he turned to his critics and asked, "Does the law permit good deeds on the Sabbath, or is it a day for doing evil? Is this a day to save a life or to destroy it?" But they wouldn't answer him. He looked around at them angrily and was deeply saddened by their hard hearts. Then he said to the man, "Hold out your hand." So the man held out his hand, and it was restored. At once the Pharisees went away and met with the supporters of Herod to plot how to kill Jesus. What do you find there? What do you hear there? Find it interesting that
They weren't compassionate because of their legalism.
It's like the legalism overrode compassion completely. And if it wasn't the Sabbath, it'd been okay. And if it would have been the next day or the day before, perfectly fine, no big issue. But because it was this day, now you cannot be so compassionate to other people.
Also, their self-righteousness.
Yeah,
There's another thing there.
a lot of self-righteousness.
The Pharisees went to, the ones that they went to fellowship with and plan with were the Herodians. That was their natural enemy.
But who in this passage was noted as the enemies?
Well, Jesus was.
No. Who was? It says who got named out as the enemies? Jesus's enemies watched him closely.
Oh, the Pharisees.
The Pharisees. I love the irony there. Yeah, you picked it up. Here Mark is calling the Pharisees Jesus's enemies, and then you have Jesus's enemies going to their enemies. And it's like, enemy of my enemy is my friend, apparently, I guess. I don't know. It's kind of a weird thing there. But it's...
But whenever you put that in its context, you wonder, what's going on here? Can't they get along with anybody?
Only who's with them. That's it. I mean, what it makes it sound. You have... It's as if the regulations of the law have now become the standard for the Pharisees over anything else, over the heart. Whereas, what's really supposed to happen on the Sabbath? Isn't that a day of mercy and compassion and love and grace? At least on our end of it, in our perspective it is. Apparently for their end it wasn't. It was, this is what you do, this is what you don't do. I don't know as though that is really what God intended the Sabbath to be. It's almost as though Jesus is looking at the Pharisees and going, congratulations, you just missed the whole point. You missed it. Congratulations. All your thinking, all your education, all that you're doing, and you missed the main thing. And in two different stories now, back to back, you have the Pharisees missing it, not getting it at all. They would rather, no, you've got to go hungry the whole day, Richard. You can't go collect food. You got to starve today. Or, no, you've got to deal with your ailment the whole day, and you can't be healed. As opposed to, it's okay to have a little bit to eat so you can actually worship better, right? If you come in on Sunday morning and you haven't eaten and there's no food and you've been all day kind of thing, you're probably not necessarily always focused on worship as opposed to your stomach ground, right? If you have an ailment, especially like this man, his hand, where he cannot extend his hand, and you're trying to worship, and in a Jewish law, he couldn't actually go into the temple because he had an ailment, right? He has a physical impairment, so there must have been some sin happening to him or his family or something in his past that's not come out, and so you can't even worship at all. But now Jesus has made it to where both can worship over what the Pharisees say. So the Pharisaical law is getting pretty much tossed to the side. And again, I don't want to just completely remove the Pharisees from the situation, because they know what they know. It's almost as though we know what we've been taught, and it's hard for us to be untaught what we've been taught. And so Jesus is trying through these situations to bring them along. But what do? Verse 6. You have the first instance of the Pharisees wanting to eliminate Jesus.
But it's interesting, Mike, that the they in this section isn't just the Pharisees.
No,
if you think about it, it's the crowds and also the 12.
Yeah.
And they're all watching him, and no one else says anything. We like to peg everything on the Pharisees because they were the leaders and they were the ones that were supposed to know better. But it's not just the Pharisees who are condemning Christ. We're condemning him by our silence. Does that make sense?
It does, but I don't know as though if we're implying that in it.
Well, there are 3 different days in that section.
Right.
Or 3 people mentioned in that section
Right.
of days. And so I didn't want to miss that when I was studying it, that I like to blame the Pharisees for all the mistakes they make.
In my passage, or in my version, it says that once the Pharisees went away and met with the supporters of Herod. So it's the Pharisees and the supporters of Herod that are plotting to kill Jesus. And now the disciples are silent. We don't hear anything from the disciples in this section. And honestly, at this point in Mark, he hasn't actually spelled out who the disciples are, other than you've had just a couple being called out. I mean, you have Levi that's been called out, and you know that he's probably got a couple others already as disciples. We're getting ready here in just a moment to hear the whole list of disciples. And I don't know, I don't want to disregard the folks that are there, because you couldn't speak against the Pharisees.
No, that's true.
I mean, if you spoke against the Pharisees, you're out. You're done. And so they're not used to. I mean, this is the first time. Jesus is probably one of the first people to ever stand up and speak against a Pharisee. Because before, whatever the Pharisees said was law, literally. I mean, they made law. And so that was what their job was. And if they said it, that's what happened. And so I don't want to totally disregard the people being quiet completely. But I think there is the, complicity. It looks like acceptance a little bit, without a doubt.
It's interesting to me that the Pharisees went to their enemy, who are a political group but not a religious group, and said, hey, we need your help. We want to kill this guy.
Yeah. And this is the first instance that you see this in Mark, where now you start seeing the conspiracy happening that you're going to hear about later in Mark.
Let's be friends.
Yeah, because we have a common enemy. Enemy of my enemy is my friend.
My study Bible says the Pharisees were willing to set aside differences to destroy a common foe.
Yep, that's exactly it. And let's don't throw them too far under the bus. Wouldn't we do the same? If we have an enemy, if we have something we want to root out of our life, situation, and you know somebody else who you may not necessarily completely agree with has the same thoughts, and they're like, hey, let's team up and let's take this out, we might succumb to that as well.
I feel like that's what
Human
the
nature.
political stuff is today anyway, all
It
the
is.
time.
It is. I mean, that's exactly what this sounds like, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You know, well, you wash my back, I'll wash your back. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, kind of thing. Yeah.
And
Well, that's the way it
I'll
is.
talk bad, hopefully you'll convert.
All right. Well, let's look at verse 7. 7 through 13. Would somebody like to read?
I will.
7 through 12. I'm sorry.
7 through 12.
Yeah.
But Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, and a great multitude from Galilee followed him, and from Judea, and Jerusalem, and I don't know how you pronounce that.
Idumea.
Idumea, and beyond the Jordan. And those from Tyre and Sidon, and a great multitude, when they heard how many things he was doing, came to him. So he told his disciples that a small boat should be kept ready for him because of the multitude, lest they should crush him. For he healed many, so that as many as had afflictions pressed about him to touch him. And the unclean spirits, whenever they saw him, fell down before him and cried out, saying, "You are the Son of God." But he sturdily warned them that they should not make him known.
The average person walks at about a 3-mile-an-hour pace. Did you know that?
Yes.
It's a pretty good pace. How long could you sustain a 3-mile-an-hour walk? 2 hours?
Maybe.
3 hours? Half hour? 10 hours? When you read where these people came from, we don't get it. We just hear the names of places, right? The area in which that covers, from north to south, is up to about 150 miles. From east to west is about 80 miles. The mode of transportation for the common person in Jesus' time was walking. How long would it take you to walk 150 miles at 3 miles an hour? A long doggone time.
Days.
Days. Literally, days. And let's just be honest. You're gonna need some rest in there sometime. So it's even more days, because there's gonna be things, and you've got to figure out food and shelter, but all these multitude. In fact, my version says a vast number of people. The idiom that's used here means you couldn't count them all. Think about that. I mean, we're talking more than like a football arena full of people showing up. Vast number of people walking days, weeks worth of time, just because they've heard about. Now think about that for a second. How did they hear about Jesus?
Word of mouth.
And how did it travel?
Fast.
The same feet. I mean, it does travel fast. When you're healing people, when you're casting out demons, when you're doing things that are mind-boggling, people will travel a good distance quickly. I mean, guys will tear a roof off a house. I mean, what's walking, right? I mean, these folks were in desperation mode for their loved ones or for themselves. And so they were doing everything they could to get there. And I like that Jesus, after doing all that he's been doing, he wants to kind of retreat to the lake with his disciples. The intimation here is that he was wanting to get away to retreat, to rest, to pray and be restored and just fill up. But the crowds kept following him everywhere he went. So much so that he looks at his disciples and says, "Hey, y'all have a boat ready for me, because we may need an escape route. We may need to, step back so we don't get crushed by all these people. There's so many people, they're going to get crushed. That's an immense amount of people. That's a vast multitude of people. And Jesus begins healing people, sick people, eagerly push forward to touch him. And that's all it took, just a touch for them to be healed. Whenever those possessed by evil spirits caught sight of him, the spirits would throw them to the ground in front of him, shrieking, "You are the Son of God." But Jesus sternly commanded the spirits not to reveal who he was. What do you hear there?
He had authority over them, of course.
Incredible authority of Jesus. Why would he tell these demons, these spirits, to not tell anybody about him?
He hadn't chosen the 12 disciples yet.
Okay, that's a good reason. He hasn't picked his disciples yet.
His time had not come.
His time had not come. Anything else?
I thought he might know that there was gonna be too many people too, so.
Yeah, it'd be more and more people showing up, right? If you were going on trial and you had to pick a witness to testify who you are, would you pick a murderer?
Oh, right.
I mean, really, you want a credible source, right? You don't go out and just find anybody willy-nilly and say, "Hey, I need you to tell people who I am." Jesus wanted the right people to declare who he was. And I also think Jesus didn't want them going out because he didn't want this to be the mission of his ministry. He had no problem healing people. He had no problem casting out demons. But that was not his main purpose of his ministry, of his mission, of his purpose of being here. And he wasn't ready to reveal that yet. And if they would have gone out and began telling everybody about him, I mean, if you've got people coming from 150 miles north and south away, 80 miles east, west away, how many more people are going to come?
A lot.
Yeah. I mean, you have vast multitudes now. What do you think you're going to have later? I mean, many more. I mean, so many that you can't count now. It's going to be multitude of multitudes of people.
They would be so surrounded him with the desire for healing that he couldn't do anything else with them.
Yeah.
I mean, he could obviously, but it would be more problematic.
Yeah. I think if Jesus would have continued doing that, take this the right way. Jesus didn't want to be the sideshow.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't want to be the circus in town. He knew that wasn't going to be a long-standing way to change people, and that was not the purpose that God had sent him to earth for. He didn't want people to misunderstand what his mission was. He was not political or a military Messiah, but he was a servant who would suffer and die. And when he's doing this, he doesn't look like the suffering servant. He doesn't look like the Messiah that they're going to put on a cross. They're ready to put him on his shoulders and parade him. And that's not what Jesus came for. He didn't want the hype, and he didn't want to be a spectacle. He wanted to be the servant. He wanted to be the Savior. He wanted to know that he wanted people to know him through his love and through his truth and through the cross, not through the sideshow. And so this kind of is the messianic secret. You'll find this in Mark, where Mark talks about Jesus silencing people from telling who he is. It's the messianic secret that comes through, and it reflects really one of our core values, that truth and holiness and power are revealed in humble, obedient servants, not through fanfare, not through self-promotion. Many times, many people will self-promote,
No, absolutely.
and it doesn't always bode them well. It doesn't always work well. I love that there's this diverse crowd, though, seeking Jesus. If you look at these areas, they're not all Jewish areas. There's Gentile areas included there. and they did not disregard anybody. They included everybody. And so Jesus was more than open for everybody of every nationality, of every creed, of every race, of every religion to come and be impacted by him. He was for everybody, not just for one, not just for the Jews. So, he was a welcoming community, and he transcended all cultural and social boundaries. A lot of what Jesus was doing was not sociably acceptable, but Jesus didn't worry about social acceptability. He just was there for a purpose. So now we get to read verse 13 through 19. Gary, could you? I'm kidding.
Could you start over?
It'll be on YouTube later.
Music practice.
Afterwards, Jesus went up on a mountain and called out the ones he wanted to go with him. And they came to him. Then he appointed 12 of them and called them his apostles. They were to accompany him, and he would send them out to preach, giving them authority to cast out demons. These are the 12 he chose: Simon, whom he named Peter, James and John, sons of Zebedee, but Jesus nicknamed them sons of thunder, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, Judas Iscariot, who later betrayed him. When you hear the list of the disciples, what do you hear? What's an apostle?
I'd say it's the upper class of discipleship, if I can put it that way, but it's those chosen by Christ for that purpose,
For what purpose?
of preaching and bringing, converting people to discipleship, but we're not all apostles, we're all disciples.
Okay.
So, that's the only way I can put it, is it's above and beyond, it's a tier
Okay.
above me.
And you're right, because you see that he called out the ones he wanted to go with him, and then he appointed 12 of them. So there were others that were there.
Yeah.
Not all of them became apostles. Okay.
But the apostles studied up under the master.
And so did others. Not just the apostles, but these guys there was a different tier. It's like they were the regional directors. Yeah. The word apostle means to send out, actually. So they weren't to just stay. They were the ones that were soon to be sent out, referring to messengers that were entrusted with a specific mission. And you hear that here when he says he gave them authority to cast out demons. So those 12 could do that. Not all of them that came apparently could do that. They were appointed. Literally means that they were made or created for this purpose. Meaning that he wasn't just merely selecting, but actively establishing a new role and authority for them and a new identity. What do you know about the disciples? This list here. You have all these disciples.
Various backgrounds,
Okay?
various jobs, they did different jobs.
Okay?
Common people.
Very common people.
And he sent them out in pairs.
Okay? He sent them out in groups. Some in pairs, some in fours.
And, 3 of them were, by association, were considered, low class fishermen.
Mm-hmm.
And, they were the inner circle, so to speak.
Yeah. And that is kind of interesting that the lowest class ones
Yeah.
were the inner circle 3.
Yeah.
Let me just read off for you a little bit about each of the disciples. Can I take that moment? And by the way, the order of the disciples that are listed is very significant. And every time you see the disciples listed, you will see Simon Peter first and Judas last. Judas Iscariot last. There's 2 Judases, by the way. And so you have Judas Iscariot last. It's kind of an interesting thing. So you have Peter, Simon Peter. He was a fisherman originally. His personality was that he was bold and impulsive and often spoke first. Significance. He's always listed first. and he becomes a central leader in the early church. His given name, Peter, shows that Jesus' intent to build his church through Peter's leadership. James, the son of Zebedee, his occupation was also a fisherman. He was the brother of John. He was one of Jesus' inner circle, and he was also the first apostolic martyr you find in Acts chapter 12, verse 2. John, James's brother, was also a fisherman. They were nicknamed the Sons of Thunder, likely because they had fiery tempers. So you think Peter is the fiery temper that speaks out. They're just the fiery temper that kind of lashes out. The funny thing is, he was later known as the Apostle of Love. He wrote the Gospel of John and 3 letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and the book of Revelation. I love the idea that he was the son of thunder, but yet wrote about love. There's transformation. That's what I hear in his path. Andrew, he's a fisherman, Peter's brother. He was the first disciple to follow Jesus, we find in John chapter 1, and he's known for bringing others to Jesus. That was his main role. He went and got Peter and brought him, right? Remember that? And he brought others. Philip, he's from Bethsaida, same town as Andrew and Peter. He was known for introducing Bartholomew or Nathaniel to Jesus. And he's an analytical thinker. When you read about him in John chapter 6, he has a very analytical mind. Bartholomew, he's likely the same person as Nathaniel in John 1. Jesus called him an Israelite in whom there is no deceit, possibly of a noble or priestly heritage. Matthew, we've already been introduced to him. He's also known as Levi. He was a tax collector, viewed as a traitor and a sinner by Jews. Probably the last person that they would have ever expected to be a disciple or an apostle. His inclusion showed that Jesus' grace to the outcast and the morally compromised. I'm so glad he did. Thomas, who ended up becoming nicknamed Doubting Thomas because he questions Jesus' resurrection in John chapter 20. He later made one of the clearest declarations of faith when he looked and said, "My Lord and my God," when he saw Jesus. Isn't that interesting that the doubter was the one who made the most bold proclamation and clearest proclamations? Tradition says that he brought the gospel to India. James, son of Alphaeus, also called James the Lesser or Less. He's likely due to being the younger or lesser prominent of all the apostles, all the disciples. Very little is known about him. They think mainly because of his youth. So there's very little known. Thaddeus, also called Judas, son of James, in Luke chapter 6. Not to be confused with Judas Iscariot, that's a different one. He's possibly the one who asked Jesus in John chapter 14, "Why do you reveal yourself to us and not the whole world?" So he's kind of pushing Jesus to let others know. Simon the Zealot. Zealot is refers to a Jewish nationalist movement that opposed Roman occupation. Significance here. You need to catch this. He would have been politically opposed to Matthew, especially, because he was a tax collector. But yet here in Jesus' band of followers, top 12, you have two opposing people come together. They would have never sat by each other at the table, never looked at each other before coming before Jesus. They would have never been in the same room. They'd have been. I'm sure Matthew would have been very scared of him in a previous life, because the zealot would have taken out his knife and taken care of him. Then you have Judas Iscariot. He's from Kerioth in Judea. He's also most likely the only non-Galilean of the group. He handled the group's money, we find out in John chapter 12, and yet he betrayed Jesus. And his inclusion in this group reminds us that proximity to Jesus is not the same as loyalty to Jesus. You can go to church and have all the knowledge of God without having any relationship with God. There's a big difference. Peter is always first whenever they're listed in all four the Gospels, and Judas is always listed last, along with the note that he's the one who betrayed Jesus. And you got to realize that happened before these were written, and so they can add those in at the end. There's also some ordering that's very significant. They're grouped usually in 4 because that's how they were sent out, in quadrants, 3 different quadrants. And so, I'm sorry, in threes, in 4 different quadrants. So they're listed, every 4th one would have been the next leader. So Simon and James and John went together. Andrew, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas and James. And then Thaddeus was Simon and Judas. And so that was the grouping that they were initially sent out with. And that was kind of how they were coordinated together to begin with. This order reflects that there is a servant leadership, not a hierarchy. And sometimes we like to think of the inner circle as being the hierarchy. You know, you've got Peter, James, and John. You always hear a lot about them, and I have a feeling the other disciples kind of looked at them as though they were the chosen 3 out of the 12, because they did get to have extra time with Jesus. And so that kind of can lean to the hierarchy, but Jesus' whole idea was the servant leadership, the servanthood was more. And if you look at who Jesus chose, it also helps us to understand that there is great potential in transformation. You know, from the very lowest of low became some of the greatest of leaders in the church. Kind of echoes a Church of the Nazarene's emphasis on grace, holiness, and inclusivity, that all are included in the family. Jesus chose the 12 ordinary men, fishermen, tax collectors, political activists, doubters, and even a traitor. And their diversity in background and temperament shows that Jesus can use anyone who's willing to follow him. The 12 also mirror the 12 tribes of Israel. And so there's a lot of parallels from the Old Testament that are brought in with these 12. So there's a ton of all that Jesus does with these 12. And just the naming of a list that if we just read them, we miss them. We miss all of the impact and the emphasis on it. So, well, you can call me a prophet. You know what? It's time. It's 7:30.
Weren't they all like teenagers?
Almost all. Yes, there was because a couple of them were married.
Yeah.
But most of them were not. And I think we'll get to this later. When Jesus is asked, hey, by the mother of 2 of them, can my boys sit to your left and right? That's how an inclination of how young they must have been, because their mother was still with them. They were young enough that their mom traveled with them to watch over them, because once they get to be 15, they're on their own. And so they might have been 13, and they weren't married yet. But a couple of them, Peter was married, and so he had a family that he left. So he was probably in his early 20s at the oldest, but most of them were pretty young when they followed. So.
Was John the youngest, John the beloved?
No.
No?
The youngest one, let's see, which one did I say?
The lesser, wasn't it?
Yeah, the lesser. James the lesser. Or James, yeah. Yeah, he was the youngest. And that's why there's hardly anything known about him. There's not a lot of background. I thought about bringing in, okay, here's what happened to them after. We can get to that later, because there is a good recording of where all they went. You know, like Thomas went to India, and where all they ventured out to, and how they martyred, and all of them died in specific ways. And it's interesting that we have the record of all of that. You know, that's a kind of a cool thing to be able to look back at and go, wow, these were real people. These aren't just stories. This is true. So, any other thoughts about tonight? Any questions? Tonight went quick.
I always wondered why Judas didn't get right like Peter did.
Well, I think the guilt got him. I think the guilt overtook him. Once he realized what he did, you know, and if you read in certain places, it says, you know, he was destined pretty much to betray Jesus. And so there's some great theological debates that happen within that. Especially from our side of the coin, where we talk a lot about free choice and free will. And what does that look like? What does that mean? And did he have the free will to say, no, I'm not going to betray him? Or did God oversee the free will and need him to do what he did? because he was there for a purpose. Had he not betrayed Jesus, Jesus would not have been crucified. And so the long-term purpose of that. And so then you also have the theological debate, is Judas in heaven or is he in hell? And is he held accountable for something that was not his choice of doing? And so you have, I mean, and that goes back to the, I don't know. We'll find out. That's the best I can tell you, so.
It's difficult for me to believe that, to read about him afterwards, that he wasn't repentant.
Yeah.
Very tough to admit to that.
And we'll talk about this next week, because next week we talk about the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. And what does that look like? What does that mean? How does that impact all of this and us, especially?
It's gonna be a good discussion.
Yeah, that'll be a good discussion. I look forward to it. I was hoping to get to that today, but I'm gonna cut us short so we don't skip over it.
Yeah.
So we don't shortchange it. All right? All right, well, thanks for coming tonight. Hope you guys have a great week, and I'll see you on Sunday. All right?